Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control and the Board of Environmental Safety, I'd like to welcome you to our joint fees workshop. Let's first go over a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. Meeting materials for this event are posted online at dtsc.ca.gov/fees events. They include the presentation slides, handouts for the environmental fee and the generation and handling fee, as well as a Board of Environmental Safety memorandum detailing the fees subcommittee updates since last year's rate setting activities. By participating in this event, you understand that this workshop is being recorded and will be posted online. If you would like to use closed captioning, you may manage your preferences by using the More menu and choosing to show or hide the subtitle. For today's workshop, you may submit your questions and comments to our presenters using the Q&A function. The chat function is also enabled. However, we ask that you use it if you need technical assistance from our meeting facilitators to improve your Zoom experience today. If you have a question for the presenters, if you have a question for the presenters through the chat feature, the meeting facilitator will ask you to resubmit your question through the Q&A function so that it can be included in the Zoom recording. Next slide, please. The purpose of today's workshop is to provide a foundational understanding of the fees that fund DTSC. Today's presentations will include information about DTSC's funding structure and how the fees are set each year. Today's workshop is not intended to actually set the rate for any of the fees. Next slide, please. Today's workshop includes a presentation by the Board of Environmental Safety, followed by DTSC. There will be opportunities for questions following the presentation. Next slide. So without further ado, my name is Gabby Nepomuceno, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of the Office of Legislation and Regulatory Review. I'll be today's facilitator. Today's presenters include Catherine Grant, Fiscal Policy and Process Improvement Manager in DTSC's Office of Financial Planning, Brian Brown, Chief Financial Officer in the Office of Financial Planning, and Swathi Sarma, Executive Officer of the Board of Environmental Safety. So with that, Swathi, would you like to get us started?
Thank you, Gabby. Great. Thank you. I would also like to introduce BES's fee subcommittee members, Board Chair Jeannie Rizzo, Board Member Sushma Bhatia, BES Staff Support myself, Senior Board Staff Engineer Linda Ocampo, Public Outreach Manager Sheena Brooks, and Board Counsel Craig Forrest. As mentioned earlier, there is a memorandum by Board Member Sushma Bhatia that is posted on our website and was also included in workshop material. I encourage you to review that along with other workshop material. Next slide. Prior to SB 158, DTSC fee rates were set by the legislature in statute. This process was inflexible and was not able to reflect changing conditions and had not been updated since the 1990s. SB 158 makes key changes. It updates the fee structure for the first time in decades. It increases funding for DTSC's programs, and it implements the following structure: generation and handling fee, a flat rate of $49.25 per ton, facility fee at tiered rates, and an environmental fee with tiered rates. Catherine will provide more detail about this fee structure later in the presentation. Next slide. So starting in fiscal year 23-24, the board has the responsibility to set fee rates annually. This annual process will ensure transparency and engagement with stakeholders. The board retains emergency rulemaking authority to make adjustments to fee rates, and it provides continuing oversight. Adopted fee regulations will remain in effect until the board determines otherwise, providing stability. Next slide. Continuing on the board's authority, Beginning this year, the board will adjust fee rate cap limits to account for inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This fee cap adjustment ensures fees remain consistent with rising costs. The adjusted fee caps will apply to most fees starting in fiscal year 24-25. The revised fee rates and caps will be provided to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, CDTFA, by October 1st, 2024. The new fee caps will be retroactive to July 1st, 2024. Next slide. So I'll walk you through this timeline, which is the annual rate setting schedule for 24-25. Beginning in January of 2023, there is an analysis of hazardous waste generation from January through December. In January, DTSC sends out fee payer notice for the prior year. And from January through June, DTSC then analyzes tonnage and generates forecasts for the following year. And we're going to focus in on another part of the timeline. Next slide. At the beginning of June, the Budget Act is enacted. And in June and July, the board then convenes rate-setting workshops. In July, the board subcommittee provides their recommendations to the full board. And at the end of August at the BES board meeting, the board will then vote to set the rate. The board goes through the emergency rulemaking process thereafter, and then rates are adopted effective October 1st and are retroactive to July 1st. In October, DTSC then sends out notice to fee payers and releases the annual fee summary. Next slide. The BES fee subcommittee has been working alongside DTSC to understand fees and to develop fee rate recommendations for 24-25. The fee subcommittee, in collaboration with DTSC, undertook 3 key initiatives: assessing the financial impact of SB 158 fee increase on DTSC's overall revenues, ensuring financial stability and effective fee rate setting for DTSC, developing a comprehensive fee rate setting process for the board, including stakeholder engagement and workshops like this one, and formulating recommendations for fee rates that are applicable for 24-25 and providing recommendations for the full board approval. Next slide. There are many factors that the board must consider for fee setting, which are the following: the statutory limits. Fee rates cannot exceed caps that are set by law, which are adjusted for inflation by annual CPI. The prior year's performance. Based on DTSC's analysis, the board will review fee revenue collected from last year to see if fee collection met or exceeded the legislature's appropriation for the associated account, and then revenue adjustments. Based on prior year's collections, the board may need to adjust fee rates to address any over or under collection. Next slide. The board must also consider legislative appropriation, the amount the legislature has allocated for the associated account, administrative costs, the direct costs of managing and collecting fees, as well as additional statewide administrative costs allocated to this program by the state. The fee rates must also allow for a reserve with the associated account. Program reserves are set aside to ensure programs are funded by this account are not impacted by revenue fluctuations or budget adjustments. The reserve has a maximum of 10% of authorized expenditures. The board is trying to strike a balance between ensuring adequate program funding and minimizing the burden on fee payers. Fee adjustments are based on data-driven approach, considering past performance and projected needs, all while maintaining a healthy reserve to protect program stability. I will now hand it over to DTSC's Fiscal Policy and Process Improvement Manager, Catherine Grant. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Swati. I'm Kathy Grant, the Fiscal Policy Manager here at DTSC, and I will be providing an overview of DTSC's fees today. This morning, we're going to be focusing on three of DTSC's fees: the environmental fee, the facility fee, and the generation and handling fee. Can you please go back one slide? Thank you. All of these fees are administered and collected by the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, often referred to as CDTFA, and collected and administered on DTSC's behalf. The fee rates are annually set by the Board of Environmental Safety, as noted earlier. Next slide. Before we dive into more details on each of the fees, let's first talk briefly about the impact of fee reform, or SB 158, on DTSC's fees. As noted earlier, SB 158 authorized the Board of Environmental Safety to annually set fee rates to each of the fees within statutory fee caps. Beginning in 24-25, fee caps will begin to be adjusted annually by the board to account for changes in cost of living as measured by the Consumer Price Index. In addition, SB 158 restructured DTSC's fees and rates as follows. The environmental fee was modified the fee tiers subject to the fee and increased the rates. For the facility fee, rates were adjusted and a new fund was created for the revenues to be deposited into the hazardous waste facility account. And then for the generation and handling fee, this was the most significant change of reform. The generation and handling fee was established through SB 158, and it consolidated 4 fees into one flat rate fee. The generator fee, the disposal fee, the EPID verification fee, and the manifest fee were all eliminated to establish this fee. Later in our presentation, we will go over these repealed fees a bit more to contextualize the generation and handling fee. With that, let's move on to the next slide. The environmental fee. The environmental fee is assessed on most California businesses that use, generate, or store hazardous materials and have 100 employees or more that worked more than 500 hours in the previous calendar year. This includes most business sectors in California, as most businesses use items like computers, cell phones, and other devices. There are some exemptions for this fee, though they are limited, and those include private households, certain nonprofits, banks and insurance companies, and governmental agencies. Next slide. The environmental fee funds a number of DTSC activities, such as cleanup activities. This includes our emergency response activities, site mitigation and restoration, brownfield cleanups, federal Superfund sites, and state orphan cleanups. It also funds our Safer Consumer Products program, as well as our administrative and support programs, such as our environmental chemistry lab, our communications, and public participation groups. Next slide. In current year, fiscal year 23-24, the environmental fee is projected to generate $120 million in revenues. These revenues are deposited into the Toxic Substances Control Account, often referred to as TSCA. Fee payers who are subject to this fee must register with CDTFA to file an electronic return and pay the fees on or before February 28th of each year. Next slide, please. As noted earlier, reform made changes to the fee tiers. This table provides a comparison of the environmental fee pre- and post-reform. Prior to reform, businesses with 50 or more employees were subject to the fee. Now, however, only businesses with 100 or more employees must pay the environmental fee. Now, shifting to the rates. Note the rates for the tiers with 100 employees but less than 500 employees did not see substantial fee increases with reform. These rates were only adjusted for CPI. However, the bottom tiers, businesses with 500 or more employees, saw significant increases, more than tripling previous rates. Additionally, notable changes from reform is the establishment of the fee cap. This table demonstrates that the fee caps are double the current rates for each of these tiers. And as noted earlier, the caps will be adjusted for CPI in the next fiscal year. Next slide. Now let's move on to the facility fee. This fee is assessed on DTSC permitted facilities that treat, store, or dispose of hazardous waste, or facilities seeking this authorization. The fee due is based on the permitting tier held by the facility operator and by the facility size. Next slide, please. The revenues collected from the facility fee are used for regulatory activities associated with the authorized facilities, or again, facilities seeking authorization. This includes inspection and enforcement activities to these permitted facilities, including criminal investigations. The fees also support our hazardous waste management policy implementation, as well as our support programs and administrative programs, such as our environmental chemistry lab, health and safety, human resources, and so forth. Next slide. DTSC estimates the facility fee will generate $14 million in revenue to the hazardous waste facility account in the current year. As noted earlier, the hazardous waste facility account, HWFA, was established by SB 158. All facilities subject to this fee must register with CDTFA and file an annual electronic return with them. The fee payments are due in 2 equal installments, with a prepayment of 50% of the fee due on or before November 30th of each year, and the return and final payment due on or before February 28th each year. Next slide. As noted earlier, the fee a facility is required to pay is based on the type of permit carried by the operator and the size of the permit, the size of the facility. What's unique about the facility fee is that each of the permitting tiers or rate categories have their own structure, which we'll discuss more in the next coming slides. The categories for this fee are full permits. These are all RCRA regulated facilities and some specified non-RCRA facilities. We have post-closure permits, which are for facilities in the post-closure phase, as well as standardized permits, which are non-RCRA facilities. And then our tiered permits or permits by rule, which are facilities operating fixed or transportable treatment units. There are a few exemptions for the facility fee, which include household hazardous waste collection facilities, solid waste disposal facilities operating load check programs, and treatment facilities performing a cleanup due to a DTSC issued order. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about full permits. In each of the rate categories within the fee, pre and post reform, full permitted facilities are distinct from the other permitting categories because the fees owed are calculated by multiplying the permit tier rate by the base rate. It's important to note that the board adopts the base rate, but the calculation for the permit tier is set in statute. Displayed in this table, you'll note that the facility fee base rate was not capped pre-reform. However, now there is a statutory cap on this base rate that will be adjusted annually for CPI in the next coming fiscal year. Next slide, please. Moving on to post-closure permits. These type of permits have different rates and tiers depending on where the facility is in the closure process. Facilities operating these permits both within the first 5 years of the closure period and after did see significant rate increases from reform, and like the full permit, has a rate cap of double the current rate. Next slide. Similar to post-closure permits, these facilities pay different rate depending on the permitting tier the facility is authorized for. These facilities also saw significant fee increases post-reform. with a rate cap double to the current rate that is adjusted to CPI or for CPI annually. Next slide. Moving on to facility fees for treatment units. Unlike the previous facility fees, treatment unit fees are assessed per unit and not per facility. However, like the other fees, the rate did increase from reform and statutory caps were enacted. However, please note the fee cap for treatment units operating under conditional exemptions are not subject to annual CPI adjustments, but the other tiers are. Next slide. Now let's discuss the generation and handling fee. As noted earlier, this fee was created by SB 158. The generation and handling fee is a flat rate per ton fee that applies to all hazardous waste generators that generate 5 or more tons of hazardous waste in a calendar year. For additional context and for purposes of the fee, a generator is any person who generates hazardous waste at an individual site. Revenues from this fee are used for regulatory activities, excluding permitted facilities. Next slide. These activities include inspection and enforcement activities, including criminal investigations, hazardous waste management policy and program support, as well as DTSC support programs and administrative functions such as health and safety, human resources, our legal office, and so forth. Next slide. DTSC estimates the generation and handling fee will generate approximately $43.2 million this year. And these fees are deposited into the hazardous waste control account. This fee is assessed on the waste generated in the prior calendar year. So, for example, in the current year, for the return due this past February, the fees were collected on waste generated in calendar year 2022, with fees due last February in the 23-24 fiscal year. The current rate for the generation and handling fee, as Swati noted, was $49.25 per ton, or fraction of a ton. Please note the full $49.25 rate is due on the fraction of a ton. So, for example, if an entity generates 9.5 tons of waste, the generator would owe $492.50 in fees, or that $49.25 rate 10 times. So the fee is just not prorated. Generators may have noticed the CDTFA return did this calculation for you this last year. In the prior year, the first year of implementation, this update had not been made. So generators were responsible for reporting and paying on the full fraction of the ton. Generation and handling fees are due in 2 equal or 50% installments. The first, and I should note, this is very similar. The dates are the same as the facility fee. So the first is a prepayment due on or before November 30th. With the remaining fee and an electronic return due on or before February 28th. Please note that if a generator generates 5 or more tons of hazardous waste in a calendar year, they are required to register with CDTFA and file an electronic return with the prescribed fee. The fee is irrespective of the type of EPID held, whether it be permanent and temporary. And if a business is closing, please work with CDTFA on filing an estimated return and following their procedures for this process. Next slide. With that, there are some exclusions and exemptions from DTSC's generation and handling fee. Some of these are intended to avoid fees being paid on the same waste twice, and it's important to note what these are so that you're aware what wastes you generate are and are not subject to the fee. Hazardous waste generated that can be excluded from the generation and handling fee calculation includes hazardous wastes that are transferred, stored, or bulked through a treatment, storage, and disposal facility en route to a destination facility. Additionally, hazardous materials recycled or reused on site and not transferred off site is also excluded. And lastly, aqueous waste treated in a treatment unit operating under either a conditional exemption, conditional authorization, or permit by rule is also excluded. So now let's move on to exemptions. Next slide. There are several exemptions to the generation and handling fee, though fewer than previously provided under the old fee structure. Hazardous waste, my apologies. Hazardous waste exempt from the fee includes waste generated from household hazardous waste collection facilities, banned, outdated, and unregistered agricultural waste submitted to a county under a collection program, and do-it-yourselfer or DIY used oil collected by a certified used oil center is exempt. However, I would note that the used oil generated by the used oil collection center is subject to the fee. Next slide, please. Some additional exemptions are hazardous waste generated by a solid waste load check operation, along with reusable soiled textile materials that meet specified conditions. Waste generated by government agencies responding to releases of waste caused by others is also exempt. However, the entity responsible for the release of the waste is subject to the fee. Therefore, we ask qualifying government entities to assist both DTSC and CDTFA with identifying and seeking collection from the responsible party. Please note, eligibility for an exemption is not affected by whether or not DTSC can find a responsible party. For instance, when a government entity responding to an unforeseen cleanup, such as emergency response activity or illegal dumping, DTSC requests being notified by the responsible party when the fees are due so we can seek collection from fees. And lastly, hazardous waste generated by a natural disaster, which is not routinely produced hazardous waste by the generator, is also exempt. Next slide, please. This table reflects the change. So let's talk about the generation and handling pre and post reform. This table reflects the changes in fees to generators pre and post reform. We'll be going over some scenarios in the next several slides to demonstrate reform impacts. So before we get there, let's first discuss the fees that were repealed. The EPID verification fee was an annual EPID verification fee on generators, transporters, and facility operators. It was a tiered fee based on the number of employees a business had. Then we have our manifest user fee, and this fee was assessed on each manifest used to transport hazardous waste. The generator fee was a tiered fee based on the amount of tonnage generated, and specifically the amount of hazardous waste generated in a calendar year, and it's the fee most analogous to our generation and handling fee. And we'll discuss that a bit more a little bit later. Then lastly, we have our land disposal fee, and this fee was collected from landfill facilities through tipping fees. Fees were assessed based on the category of hazardous waste being disposed. In lieu of collecting all four of these fees, the single flat rate per ton fee was enacted. Additionally, there is a statutory cap for the generation and handling fee. It is double the current rate at $98.50 and will also be adjusted for CPI in the coming fiscal year. So, how did the restructure of fee impact generators, practically speaking? Over the next few slides, we'll be going over a hypothetical scenario in which all factors are the same except for the tonnage generated. We will be comparing the impacts of reform for generators who produce 20, 500, 2,000, and 5,000 tons. Next slide, please. So let's begin with scenario 1. Last year, a California business with 150 employees generated 20 tons of non-RCRA hazardous waste. This waste was transported on 75 manifests and sent to a California landfill. In this situation, Pre-reform, a fee payer would have paid approximately $1,100 in fees. However, now the fees owed are pretty similar, with there being a small savings to the generator. Next slide. Now for scenario 2, all factors stay the same, only the generator is now going to be producing 500 tons of hazardous waste. In this situation, pre-reform, a fee payer would have paid approximately $54,000 in fees. Under reform, the total fees paid by the generator are significantly less, with the generator only paying about $25,000 in generation and handling fees, which is about $29,000 less than the fees due pre-reform. Next slide. For scenario 3, we're going to increase our tonnage even further to 2,000 tons of hazardous waste generated. In this scenario, the fee payer will continue to pay lower fees than what was due pre-reform, saving approximately $14,000 in fees annually. Next slide. In our last scenario, we're going to increase the hazardous waste generated to 5,000 tons. Now, in this scenario, the generator will owe significantly more fees post-reform. So let's talk about that a bit more. Next slide. This table summarizes the pre- and post-reform impacts of each of the scenarios we just discussed. You'll notice the generator fee in the last 2 scenarios didn't change. This is because the generator fee was actually capped at $100,000 in the previous fee structure. This means pre-reform, generators who produce more waste actually paid less in generator fees per ton than generators who produce less waste. Some fee payers paid as much as $100 per ton, where larger generators paid less than $10 per ton. One of the core tenets of reform was to create an equitable fee framework that fully funded DTSC's mission and statutory mandates. The generation and handling fee was established to do just that. Now, we're 2 years into the implementation of this fee, and the fee has not been generating the revenues anticipated. To discuss that further, I will turn to our CFO, Brian Brown.
Thank you, Catherine. Again, my name is Brian Brown. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for DTSC, and thank you all for being here this morning. We did want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit more about the generation and handling fee shortfall. This is an important issue for DTSC, and it's one that we've received a number of questions about over the course of the last year. So we want to talk a little bit about where we are and where we are going. Next slide, please. So first, as a bit of background, the generation and handling fee, again, was established as part of the SB 158 reform bill, and last year was the first year that the fee was in effect. As the year went along, we identified that the fee revenues were coming in lower than were previously projected as part of reform and as part of the state budget. So in 22-23 fiscal year, we estimate that we received about $43 million from generators. By comparison, the fee had been projected to generate $81 million. So you can see that the actual amount of revenue was just barely above half of what had been expected and budgeted for. That shortfall in revenue was addressed as part of this year, the 23-24 state budget, in which the governor and legislature agreed to provide the department with $55 million in loans to help keep the hazardous waste control account solvent for the end of the current fiscal year. One of the advantages of that approach was both that it provided us with sufficient revenue to maintain our operations, but it also allowed the board to keep the generation and handling fee rate the same in the current fiscal year as it was in the prior fiscal year, with the idea that that would provide the department with time to do analysis and determine the cause of the shortfall before any further fee rates were enacted. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing over the past year since the shortfall was identified? We've done a few things. First of all, we've been doing an evaluation of the data that we have available to us to identify why revenues were lower than projected. This involves looking both at the data that is collected and available to the department of our department, DTSC. This includes information that we collect through our EVQ system on generators, as well as information we have on manifested waste through our HWTS system, and comparing that with the data collected by CDTFA on fee returns. In doing that analysis, we've identified a couple of issues, or at least confirmed some issues that were identified preliminarily in last spring. One of those is related to noncompliance. I've identified that there are some subset of fee payers that are either not paying their fee or paying less than what the data suggests that they would owe. We also have identified that we have a number of fee payers that are paying late. Another issue that's come up is the broad or inconsistent use of the statutory exemptions and exclusions that Catherine spoke about earlier. So probably the most significant of these is the exemption that is available to government agencies for cleaning up waste that is caused by someone else. What we've identified is that the use of that is probably broader and not consistently used and not targeted towards things such as cleanup of spills or cleanup of illegal dumping. Now, one of the challenges that we've had in the course of doing this analysis is with the data that we have available to us. This is both in the form of there are gaps in the data that we have available to us. So, for example, we have not historically asked for information on exemptions. We also had not historically had the same level of information on unmanifested waste as we do with manifested waste. The other challenge we've had is with respect to the fact that these different data systems that we've relied on, so that includes the fee revenue data that is collected by CDTFA, the generator data in EVQ, and the manifested waste data in HWTS. All those data systems that we use were developed independently and were not necessarily designed to talk to each other. So that makes the analysis that we have to do to compare across those different systems a very manual and labor-intensive process. We've also, in addition to that evaluative work we're doing, we've recognized that it's been really important that we increase our communication to generators so that they understand their responsibilities as well as how the law has changed since pre-reform. So we've taken efforts to coordinate with CDTFA on our communication so that we're utilizing more consistent and information that we put out either on our website or through other communications that we've made, such as through additional notifications that we've sent out. We also, for the first time ever, had a webcast in January, so prior to the final returns being due, a webcast that was attended by thousands of generators and was provided a lot of additional information to them. And then additionally, we've been looking for opportunities to address some of those data challenges I just spoke about. So, for example, CDTFA updated their fee returns such that they now require additional information on waste generated and exemptions. And we're also exploring additional opportunities to improve our DTSC data system to collect comparable information so that we can make our comparisons with CDTFA's data easier. Next slide, please. So that's where we are. So what's going to happen next? The probably most important next step for folks to be aware of is that the governor will release his May revision proposals on or around May 15th. This is a standard part of the state's budget cycle where the governor releases additional information following, or additional proposals, that is, following the April tax returns. We anticipate that the May revision will include a proposal to address the generation and handling fee shortfall. Once that is available, that will be public information, the proposal. It'll be on the Department of Finance's public website. And once that's released, the legislature will have budget hearings, probably in the period of late May and early June. where they will consider this proposal. These budget hearings will be public as well, and we'll have an opportunity for public comment. Ultimately, that's all leading toward the enactment of the 2024-25 Budget Act, which should be enacted on or before the beginning of the new fiscal year, which begins on July 1st. Ultimately, once that the Budget Act is enacted, the board will then have the information that it needs to do its fee rate setting process. It'll know at that point. It'll know at that point the final amount of expenditure authority that the department has, as well as assumptions about revenues available to the department. And then with that information, it can have its public workshops and meetings in order to meet its statutory deadline of setting the fees, the fee rate, and no later than October 1st. With that, I'll turn it back to Gabby. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Next slide, please. All right, so that concludes our presentation portion for today's workshop. A lot of information shared today can be found on DTSC's webpage at dtsc.ca.gov/fee payer resources. CDTFA also has a very helpful resource guide on these fees at their webpage at cdtfa.ca.gov/taxes and fees/hazardous substance fee. And as I mentioned at the start of today's workshop, there are 2 handouts available on DTSC's fees web pages as well, related to the G&H fee and the environmental fee. Next slide, please. So lastly, I want to leave you with some contact information. Depending on your question, you have direct access to experts about the electronic verification questionnaire, or EVQ, the hazardous waste tracking system, or HWTS, and of course, these fees. If you have general questions about engaging with the legislature, you can contact my team. And if you have questions for CDTFA, our partners over there can be contacted at the web address on the slide. So before we begin the Q&A portion of today's workshop, we've been together for quite a while now, so we're going to take a short break and we'll reconvene. Let's see, it's 10:47, so you can go to the next slide, please. We have 10 minutes on the slide, but let's reconvene right at 11 o'clock for our Q&A session, and we will see you in a few minutes. See you soon. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are now in the Q&A period of our workshop, and to facilitate the questions, we'll first go to the questions and comments that were submitted to DTSC in advance. We'll then go to the questions received during the presentation, and finally the questions we received in this segment. As a reminder, due to the large audience we have joining us today, we ask that you submit your questions and comments using the Zoom Q&A the Zoom Q&A feature. For those that entered questions anonymously, please email us directly with those questions so that we can follow up with you after today. Okay, so let's go to our first question that was received in advance. And actually, some of these questions we received after the January webcast, so I do want to bring back some of those because they may be pertinent to some of our viewers today. So with this first question, Kate, these are really more about the CDTFA payment process. So I'm going to look to you for some of these questions.
Right.
All right, our first question. How can I confirm whether I paid my fees in a prior year? I think I paid, but I can't find a receipt.
That's a great question. It's important to note that this fee is collected and administered by the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. So they keep records of what fee payers have and have not paid. So it's best to reach out to them regarding your account, and they can work with you further.
Great. And what is the process to dispute the amount that CDTFA says I owe?
Yeah, so that is also something you'll have to work with CDTFA on. They do have a formal process for appealing fees or requesting redeterminations. And there are specific circumstances in terms of whether or not you need to do an appeal or determination based on whether or not you have or have not paid. So please work with CDTFA regarding your specific case.
All right. My business requires an invoice to pay the fees. I can't pay electronically, so how do I do it?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So when you file your return, there is an option to print a payment voucher, which is essentially your invoice. So you can file the return without paying the fee. I should note that. Instead, what you could do is print that voucher and then work with your accounting section to actually issue the check to go along with that voucher and submit that to CDTFA. Uh, for forms of payment, please check out CDTFA's webpage under How Do I Make a Payment for additional guidance.
Great. Okay, so last year a business paid the environmental fee, but this year they have less than 100 employees and would be exempt from paying the fee. So how should they file their return?
Yeah,
Or
so
should they file a return?
Yeah, so you're only subject to the environmental fee if you have 100 or more employees who work more than 500 hours in the prior calendar year. However, if you register with CDTFA, and so say one year you had to pay the fee and the next year you had 98 employees, CDTFA does require you to still file a return, even if you're reporting $0, because you're registered. So if you have decrease the number of employees, you can work with them regarding your specific account and modifying the business activities registered under your account number.
Okay. So it's still somewhat related to CDTFA's processes, but now the crossover with today's topic. Why did the return information change this year?
Yeah, so we're only in our second year of implementing reform, and this is still pretty new for DTSC, and implementation's an iterative process. So last year was the first year of the generation handling fee, and the return filed with CDTFA required generators to provide information at the EPAD site level. This year, we've modified the returns even further, so it collects additional information about gross tonnage and any exemptions or exclusions claimed. This year, the system was also upgraded to auto calculate fees owed and rounds up the tonnage to the next full ton.
Got it. Okay, so let's see. My CDTFA return asked me to itemize exemptions, but I don't know if I should have included used oil that was recycled. I think it's up to you, Kate.
Yeah, so yes, the return for exemptions and exclusions is itemized and was generally more detailed this year. One of the exemptions that a generator might be able to claim is DIY used oil. However, used oil, or excuse me, recycled oil is not exempt. So all other used oil, even if it's recycled, is still subject to the generation and handling fee.
So still on topic of the generation and handling fee, how does EVQ relate? We've heard a lot about kind of both of those, but I think there's still some confusion about what one has to do with the other.
Yeah, great question. I would note the EVQ system in the old fee structure did collect fees, so it's very easy to kind of commingle these two systems. But it no longer does since the fees that it previously collected, the EPID and the manifest fees were repealed. What the EVQ system is an electronic verification questionnaire that all generators are required to complete annually. It enables DTSC to collect information about the generator and generator activities, like the number of employees. It also collects general information about the waste the generator manages, such as the top waste streams, and requires a generator to validate some of the information within the hazardous waste tracking system. So simply put, the EVQ is administered by DTSC and its purpose is for generators to report DTS information to the department about their generator activities, whereas the generation and handling fee is collected and administered by CDTFA and is assessed on the applicable waste is assessed on the applicable waste generated. Some of the information in EVQ informs the fee collection process, but it is separate from CDTFA's process and serves different purposes.
Okay, so we've gotten a couple of questions about EVQ and a Form 303, which I believe is a cow recycle form. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the EVQ and the Form 303 may be similar, but they do collect different information and are used for different purposes by different departments. So they may have reporting, separate reporting requirements, and those are separate and apart from DTSC's regulatory and reporting requirements. So for Form 303, please reach out to Cal Recycle as they administer that form.
Okay. We have a couple questions here about the years that we're referring to. So there's confusion over the calendar year versus fiscal year deadlines. And I think it really comes down to what am I paying for and when?
Great question. A very important question. So, the fee is assessed on the waste generated in a calendar year, and then it's paid the following fiscal year. So, if you generate waste at any point during, January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2022, that waste is going to be subject to the generation and handling fee. And you would have had to have filed your return in November of 2023, or excuse me, made a prepayment in November of 2023 of 50% of that fee, and then the second half of that fee along with the return in February of 2024. It can be a bit confusing because on CDTFA's notices, when they're talking about reporting period, they're actually referring to the fiscal year in which the fee is due. So your statement from CDTFA will say December of 2023. What that is indicative of is the 2023 fiscal year. So, great question.
Okay, so as a follow-up to that question, why is there such a large gap in time between when the waste is generated and when it's paid for? I think it can be, as much as 18 months, really.
Yeah. The period between waste generation and the fiscal year payment allows both DTSC and BES to forecast the revenue subject to the fee. It also provides us time to collect information on the amount of hazardous waste generated, since that also has a lag, and is designed to provide enough time for the board to set the rate after the budget's been enacted. I don't know, Swati, would you like to provide some additional information on that?
Sure, Kate. So the board is required to set the rate at a level that meets DTSC's appropriation in the Budget Act, but we do not know what that will be until the legislature actually passes it. That typically occurs in June, then goes into effect in July. And so then thereafter, we will be having some additional workshops. In the meantime, between January and July, CDTFA collects fees from the prior fiscal year, and DTSC evaluates how much hazardous waste was generated that would be subject to this fee. Over the summer, the board discusses DTSC's fund conditions and the enacted budget, and all of these factors enable the board to then adopt regulations to set the rate by October, which is then the basis for the prepayment that is due the following month in November.
All right, so it's quite the list of steps that it takes to get from waste generation to actually that final payment, nearly 2 years later. So I understand that there's still a lot of questioning and confusion over this process. So I appreciate that walkthrough. Okay, so how do I know if I generated more than 5 tons in a year? I think, Kate, this is probably more your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I can take that one. It's the generator's responsibility to track the waste generated under their EPIDs and validate the information in the hazardous waste tracking system. If it's inaccurate, they should reach out to DTSC to correct the information. If they generate hazardous waste, they are required to register with CDTFA. And I should say, if they generated 5 tons or more, they're required to register with CDTFA. And pay for the tonnage that's subject to the fee. But ultimately, the generator should be tracking and managing the waste they produce and keeping records of the weight tickets on said waste.
Got it. Okay, so these next few are for Swati. Why did the board not raise rates this year? Why did the board not raise rates this year? Sorry.
So, as noted in the board's memo for this workshop, SB 158 had already adjusted the fees significantly from the prior fee structure. Additionally, the legislature had provided a loan to DTSC to cover the cost of the current year's shortfall, so that DTSC had time to assess the root cause of the shortfall without unduly burdening fee payers further.
Okay, so does the board plan on raising rates this year?
It's honestly too early to say. We need to see what will be enacted in the state budget in June, as well as what the fund conditions of each fund at the end of the current fiscal year will be. DTSC is also evaluating the tonnage generated in the calendar year for 2023 that is subject to fee.
Got it. Okay. So can you speak a little bit about what the difference between the rate cap and the fee rate is? And will the cap be this year's rate?
Sure. So the cap set in statute by legislature and is currently at $98.50. And that's the cap. That's the uppermost cap. The fee rate is set annually in regulation and is based on the factors we talked about today. So the fund condition, the tonnage generated, and then the budget act. The board sets the rate each year and it cannot exceed that statutory cap. Only the legislature can change that cap. Also, it's just too early to say what this year's rate will be. We just don't know. I encourage fee payers to participate in the board's rate setting workshops, as well as our board meetings that are coming up this spring and summer, so that you can be part of the rate setting discussions.
Appreciate that. Okay, so in the presentation, it looks like all the rate caps are double this year's rate. Does that mean every time the rate is increased, the cap will also increase?
No, the board is only authorized to adjust the cap by CPI. And any increase beyond CPI would need to be enacted by the legislature.
Okay, and how does the CPI adjustment work for all these fees?
So the Department of Industrial Relations is the one that sets the California Consumer Price Index. The percentage changes from one year to the next, and it's applied to the fees.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. We're going to turn back to you, Kate. Why were collection facilities able to claim exemptions in calendar year 2022, but not in 2021? There was no exemption functionality on the CDTFA website for 2021.
Yeah, the exemptions were the same in both years, and if applicable in 2021, would likewise be applicable in 2022. Reporting on the exemptions claimed was an update with this most recent return. So if you believe your payment in 2021 was incorrect, you should reach out to CDTFA to amend your return.
Okay, and there are processes online that explain how to do that?
Yes. Yes, it's available. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, let's see. So we have an example here. I run a temp agency for companies all over the state. Why am I being charged the environmental fee? The employees work for other companies. I only handle HR and admin type functions like payroll.
So for purposes of the environmental fee, the temp agency is the employer and is required to pay the fee as they are the ones who are paying the employees. So the number of employees are counted against that business, not who you're contracting with to outsource their services, if you will.
Okay. Okay. In the scenarios, the presenter said the disposal fee went away. So why am I still paying the landfill?
Yeah, good question. So DTSC no longer collects a disposal fee. However, disposal facilities may still impose a tipping fee. That's outside of DTSC's authority. Local tipping fees are typically regional fees or taxes and may include a cost imposed by the business itself.
Okay, so this sounds like a little bit when you stay at a hotel or something and you see on your receipt all these extra line items.
Yeah, essentially, but the disposal facility is going to be implementing that to whoever is disposing. And again, those fees aren't collected by DTSC or provided to DTSC.
Okay. If I have a facility permit, do I also pay the generator fee? And since we talked about generator fee was repealed, can you speak a little bit more about the difference between generator and where we're at now?
Yeah. Under the previous fee structure, if you are an authorized operator, you would have been exempted from paying the generator fee because you paid the facility fee. But this exemption was not carried over into the generation and handling fee. Under the current fee structure, all facilities are required to pay the generation and handling fee for the waste they themselves generate. For additional information, please reach out to DTSC regarding your situation.
Okay. Now this is more about waste type. So is there a difference in cost for RCRA waste versus non-RCRA waste?
Under the prior fee structure, the disposal fee varied by waste type. However, under the generation and handling fee, the rate is the same for all waste generated, regardless of whether it's RCRA versus non-RCRA.
Okay, this is a bit of a long question, so please bear with me. Let's say we have a landfill that's not authorized is not an authorized disposal facility for treated wood waste, but it receives it from residential and commercial generators to be consolidated in a roll-off bin that is then transported to a solid waste landfill that is authorized to accept the treated wood waste. In this example, the first landfill is not actually generating the treated wood waste. Can the first landfill claim an exemption from the G&H fee?
So the original generator is responsible for paying the generation and handling fee on that waste. Consolidators, as an example, would not be responsible for those fees. Could you repeat that last part?
Sure, I kind of muddled that one a bit. So the first landfill, the one who's not authorized, is not actually generating the treated wood waste. So can they claim the exemption from the G&H fee?
So they would be able to exclude that waste from the total tonnage subject to the fee. But it's important to note that the landfills should report both the gross tonnage and the net tonnage after their exclusions, as well as any other exemptions or exclusions on their annual return with CDTFA.
Okay, so make sure it's accounted for at least through the return process.
Correct.
Okay. All right, so I'm having trouble registering with CDTFA. How do I file?
Yeah, so CDTFA has some really helpful resources on their webpage for how to register. They also have a great tutorial and provided a great tutorial in our January webcast, in which CDTFA walks through how to register and to create an account. They also have some additional resources to walk you through registering for a new business activity on YouTube as well. But I do recommend that you go back to the January webcast and review that segment. It's about halfway into the recording and is posted on our Fee Events webpage.
Great. All right, so we have a question here. I don't know if the waste I generated is hazardous. How do I make that determination so I can pay the fee?
So I'm not an expert at hazardous waste, so I can't answer on how to make a hazardous waste determination. For that, I would reach out to DTSC's Regulatory Assistance Office. They do provide informal guidance regarding hazardous waste. If you determine it's hazardous waste, but you're not sure if it's subject to the fee, you can reach out to me through the fees questions and comments contact form.
And I've seen in the chat our meeting facilitators are providing the different ways to contact folks, so hopefully that one is captured as well. Okay, so are household hazardous waste facilities exempt from any of the fees?
So authorized local hazardous waste facilities are exempt from the generation and handling fee and also the facility fee. However, for your specific situation, I recommend you reach out to DTSC to look into it more closely.
Okay, so coming back to EVQ for a moment, and while we're on the topic of household hazardous waste facilities, are these facilities required to report in EVQ? I think they are, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I will note, this is a shift from previous year. EVQ serves as a way for DTSC to verify waste generation activity, as well as collect additional general generator information, address information, update to ownership, anything like that. So even if the waste an entity generated is exempt rather, generators are still required to submit this information per statute to DTSC, and this is separate from other local and state requirements.
Okay, so just to reiterate that and to clarify, so they are required to report an EVQ, and that's new with this new fee structure, but they are still exempt from the G&H fee, depending on their cert.
Yeah, so they are exempt from G&HV, and yeah, they do have to file an EVQ. It's not a result of SB 158. It's just a result of DTSC continuing to modify and evaluate on an annual basis which generators we need to collect more information from.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. It wasn't a SB 158 sort of emanating change. Okay, so in the presentation, there was a statement about the board setting the rate so that it's not adversely affected by revenue shortfalls. Does that mean the board will or will not change the fee rate given the shortfall the other presenter talked about? So perhaps, Brian, I could turn to you for this question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. Thank you. Yeah, so it's a really good question. But unfortunately, given where we are at this point in the year, it's a little bit premature to say how the rate will be set for next year, because there's still some key data points that we need to be able to provide to the board for its rate setting process. So we need, for example, still to validate the 2023 tonnage data on which the fee is subject. We still have to see what our final appropriation level is for the department in the 2023-24 Budget Act. We still have to see what our final fund condition looks like for the end of this year. And then, of course, we need to see what final changes, if any, are adopted as part of the May revision that I spoke about earlier. Swati, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure, thank you. I think you covered it, Brian, but I will just plug that there are different ways to engage with DTSC and the board and even the legislature this spring. So for the board, we have our board meetings. We have one in May, we have another one in July, and we will have multiple workshops as well through the summer. And like you said, there will be budget hearings this spring. So I encourage all stakeholders and the public to engage with DTSC, the board, and the legislature in this process.
Awesome. I'm going to take a moment too to kind of build off of that as well, that we do have an e-list specific to our fee payers. So if you want to receive notices about fee payer events like today's workshop, you may have gotten it from that e-list. But if there's anyone that you know that is not part of that e-list already, highly encourage you to sign up so that you can stay up to date on all these different discussions. And of course, the board's e-list as well. Okay, Swati, while I have you, this question, I think, will go to you first. Why were the fees increased in the first place?
Sure. So it's critical to ensure that DTSC has sufficient funding to support regulatory activities required under law and to protect communities and the environment. And Brian, I don't know if you'd like to add on to that.
Yeah, sure. No, that's right. And it's important to know that historically the fees weren't keeping pace with the actual increase in department costs, either due to inflation or other mandates that we were given from the legislature through different statutes over time. And it had originally been set in the mid 90s. So the consequence of that was, prior to fee reform, our funds were actually underfunded. The revenues coming in were less than even what we were budgeted for as well, so that we had to have general fund backfills just to keep the fund solvent for several years. And reform was meant to address that ongoing structural deficit.
All right, that sounds quite complex. Okay, so let's move on to this next question. I received a notice saying I owe fees for house fire. What do I do now? And I already have an account, but I don't know how much I pay, or how much I owe, rather. Maybe Kate, can you help with this one?
Yeah, sure. So if you already have an account with CDTFA, please reach out to them for assistance on the specifics of how to pay fees. I would note just for all generators, it is a generator's responsibility to track the waste they generate at a site, and they must report that when filing a return. As the return is self reported, CDTFA will send a notice to generators of the fees they estimate to be owed after the return is filed or after the return is due, not before.
Okay. Let's see. So we have a request for DTSC and the board to consider a program requirement for RCRA info volume data to reflect accurate weights and volumes as the existing conversion rates erroneously inflate some volumes. I'm not very familiar with these systems. So perhaps Kate, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with our conversion factors either. I would recommend that you reach out to our manifest corrections area for any questions regarding conversions in RECRA info and the hazardous waste tracking system. So please contact manifest corrections at dtsc.ca.gov.
Let's see. We have a question here. Is it essential to set rates on October 1st that's retroactive to July 1st? Receiving a bill in October that is paid the following July seems much more straightforward and easier to comply with. And I'm just going to go ahead and acknowledge, I know this was answered previously as we walk through kind of what goes into the rate setting process. And there's a sequence of events that is really based on when information comes available to DTSC. So acknowledging that, yes, it is a complex system with a lot of moving pieces, but it is set up in a way that we're working from a data-driven perspective. Okay. How does a business determine if it has 100 employees or more? Is it by division, by department, or a specific location? Kate, could you help with this one? I think this relates to the environmental fee.
Yeah. So it depends on how the business files the payroll information with EDD, the Employee Development Department. That information is provided to CDTFA as they administer and collect the environmental fee on DTSC's behalf. But largely it's tied to your EIN or your FIN associated with your business entity and essentially the way that you file your payroll taxes.
And so DTSC really doesn't have a role in any of that.
Correct. The environmental fee is solely administered and collected by CDTFA.
Okay. All right, let's see. So on topic of the environmental fee, is it different than the facility fee?
Oh, yes. The environmental fee is paid by most California businesses who have 100 or more employees, whereas the facility fee is only for facilities authorized or permitted by DTSC. DTSC authorized facilities may be required to pay both fees if they have more than 100 employees.
And then just to build on that too, if that facility generates waste, they may also be required to pay the G&H fee.
Correct, on the waste they themselves generated, not the waste that's transferred or stored or bulked through their facility.
Okay. And I think we talked about that in a bit more detail during the January webcast. So there's some good information in that webcast as well.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. What about on topic of transferring waste and such? How are out-of-state hazardous waste fees calculated within the G&H fee for a destination state?
Yeah. So hazardous waste that's imported to California, that first recipient of the waste becomes the generator for purposes of paying the generation and handling fee.
So it becomes subject to the G&H fee essentially when it crosses the border into California.
Correct, because it then becomes subject to California regulation.
Yeah. Okay, so can both G&H fee payments, the prepayment and the final payment, be made at the same time?
Yeah, I would definitely have to defer to CDTFA on that particular issue. I will say the prepayment is just a prepayment screen where you're just putting funds on your account. So I would defer to any entity in terms of how they want to, prepay their fees. I will say that the even if you pay the full fee, you are still required to file a return. And so that return must be filed that following February 28th, even if all the money has already been provided. You have to have both.
Okay.
But for more information, I would totally defer to CDTFA as it's their system and they administer and collect this fee on our behalf.
Okay. Let's see. Does the generation handling fee apply to waste generated by environmental cleanup activities? Are U.S. government sites excluded?
Yeah, I'll take that question. So, cleanup activities are not exempt from generation and handling fees, and government entities are not exempt from paying fees. There is a limited exemption provided in statute for government entities who generate waste in response to a release caused by another person, meaning the government is not the responsible party. I encourage you to work with CDTFA if you believe you may qualify for this exemption. But I do want to note it's not a blanket exemption, and government is responsible for paying fees on the waste they generate.
Okay. I still don't understand the new procedure for the G&H fee. Are the payments two equal payments?
Yeah, per statute, the prepayment and the return should be equal payments. It should be 50% in November and the remaining 50% in February, along with the return.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Please define what I have to do to report. Usually the payment asks from January to December. Please advise.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to an earlier question about the confusion with the timelines. For reporting your waste, it's going to be on the calendar year the waste is generated, but file your return in the applicable fiscal year. As noted earlier, on any notices sent from CDTFA, when they're referring to a reporting period, they're referring to the fiscal year. And so currently, like for this fiscal year, the notices say December 31st of 2023. That's indicative of the 23-24 fiscal year. So it can be a bit confusing. There is a helpful table available both on CDTFA's website and in our generation and handling fee handout that kind of provides an overview of what each of those timelines are and what you will see from CDTFA and what that means.
Okay. So when you go to file your return, you report on what exactly?
Yeah, so with this new return process, you'll be reporting both on the gross tonnage generated at your site, and then what you'll do is you'll itemize your exclusions and exemption to get a net total. And then the system will calculate the fees, round up the fees based on that net number.
Okay.
But it will be itemized not only by the gross tonnage and net tonnage, but also by EPID. Because returns are filed at an account level, so as a generator, you have an account and you might have several businesses or several EPIDs that all are part of your business. You will be reporting this data on each and every one of those EPIDs you claim.
So it's itemized by tonnage as well as by EPID.
Correct.
Okay. Let's see. Does the exemption apply to Caltrans projects?
So it depends. As noted just a couple questions ago, there is a government exemption, but this is not a blanket exemption for government entities. This exemption is pretty limited to government entities who are responding to a release caused by another person. Again, meaning that the government is not responsible for the release. So if a government is performing some cleanup activity and they're responsible for releasing that hazardous waste, then they would be subject to the fees.
Okay. Let's see. Is there a specific person or contact number if there are questions regarding like the G&H fee as it relates for a specific situation?
Yeah, so depending on your question, we have several people who can assist you, and we'll share those contact points again at the end of the workshop today. If you're unsure who to contact, please reach out to us through the fees, comments, and question form, and we'll contact you or at least get you connected to the right folks. The form link has been shared in the chat, I believe.
Yep, it looks like Sheena's right on top of that. So thank you, Sheena, too. Let's see. Let's see. Does DTSC have an estimate of what the CPI increases to the caps will be in percentage terms in the budget year? Perhaps Swati, you could take this one.
Sure. So it'll depend on the Department of Industrial Relations determination next month. And historically, it appears to have been varied a few percentage points. So we'll know in the summer what that looks like.
Okay, great. Let's see. So on slide 41, the net on this scenario is still positive. So is it fair to say that the shortfall is in part due to the net increases from larger generators not being able to offset the net decreases from smaller generators? And forgive me, I don't recall what was slide 21, but perhaps Brian or Kate, you know which one this is referring to.
Yeah, I think I can take that, and Kate, feel free to add on, but I think this was referring to the different scenarios for the generation and handling fee pre and post reform that Catherine showed. So I think the question is whether just the shortfall is caused by the not enough increase in revenues from the larger generators relative to possible decreases to smaller generators. It's actually more complicated than that, and for a couple reasons. One is that even for the smaller generators, whether they're paying more or less under the new fee structure versus the old fee structure, is not just based on whether they're a smaller or larger generator. It's dependent where they fell within the tier that they were in. And then, of course, even beyond that, some of the things that I identified, that there are really issues beyond just the size of the generator, the issues around non-compliance and use of exemptions that we believe are contributing to the overall shortfall.
Okay, so let's see. Since the federal government managed manifest and waste records via RCRA info, why don't we remove the manifest tracking system for DTSC and just use the information through RCRA info? This would remove excess work. There would be a need for multiple databases, and it would be generally easier for facilities to maintain and provide data for the fee calculations. Let's see, maybe Kate, you spoke a little bit earlier about RCRA info.
Yeah, I could take it. So RCRA Info is a federal database that adheres to federal regulations. California has additional tracking and report and record keeping needs, which is why there is a California-specific database, the Hazardous Waste Tracking System. If you see discrepancies or need more information about HWTS, you could contact our HWTS team via email at hwtsadmn, so admin, but without an I, at dtsc.ca.gov. And we could drop that in the chat as well. Oh, Sheena's on it. Thank you, Sheena.
Okay, so let's see. Because it was noted that one of the causes of the shortfall was a reduction in waste generated, what can DTSC share with us today regarding the total hazardous waste generated since DTSC's budget proposal was released a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so I could take that. The amount of hazardous waste generated fluctuates from year to year. In 2022, waste generation was lower than prior year, and we're still assessing the total tonnage for 2023. And more importantly for today's topic, how much of that waste, that 2023 waste, is subject to the fee for fiscal year 24-25 rate.
Okay. You spoke to this a little bit earlier, but if you could just reiterate the information you shared. So for the payments with the G&H fee, it's 2 installments. A generator would have to go into CDTFA's system twice, right? They'd have to go in both in November and in February to be able to pay both payments, prepayment and final payment.
That's correct. So a business first would need to register for an account with CDTFA and then register for a new business activity under that account. And then, yes, during the prepayment phase, they will make a prepayment reporting what that 50% amount should be. But no other data is collected at that time. And then that final prepay or that final payment and return, you'll pay the remainder and then also report the itemized details by EPID and waste generation. And then depending on how your business operates, as noted before, if you need to, provide an invoice in order to make the payment, the system does provide that to you as well. But I would defer to CDTFA on more specifics regarding their system.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking through. I see some of them were answered live already. See, for the RICR manifest login, why is the website asking for, this is social security number, when manifests are assigned to the company, not the individual uploading the manifest forms? So I'll just note that we don't have any of our technical staff on. I know Kate, you referred to RICR info a bit. So we can share some information for who to contact for those types of questions, but I don't think any of us today are prepared to be able to answer that question. So perhaps, you could add into the chat contact information for my RICRA ID at dtsc.save.gov and then the phone number for the help desk. As always, Sheena, you're right on top of it. So thank you. Okay, so coming back to the payment process, how do I make a payment online? I was having trouble being able to do this.
Yeah, I can take that. So we have heard that there have been some challenges with making the payment online. Again, this is not DTSC system, it's CDTFA. So I would have to defer to them, but they do provide numerous video tutorials that could be found on CDTFA's website. I'm sure Sheena will drop it into the chat at lightning speed. And you could also contact them directly at 1-800-400-7115.
Let's see. Maybe Brian, you might be able to speak to this in terms of timing. When does DTSC intend to release its full evaluation of the causation of the generation and handling fee revenue shortfall? And can we expect to see that full evaluation as part of or accompanying the budget change proposal anticipated with the May revise?
Yeah, so the May revision proposal, once it approved and adopted as part of by the governor and the administration, that'll include our summary of our analysis and our the conclusions that we reached based on that data analysis, and then that will inform whatever recommendations are part of the proposal from the governor. And that'll be the May revision will be released on or about May 15th, so just a couple of weeks.
It sounds like this is highly anticipated for a lot of our fee payers. Okay, so let's see. How to properly complete a prepayment for the hazardous waste generation and handling fee. I think we spoke to that a little bit earlier. It's through the CDTFA process. I just want to reiterate that you would have to register and create an account, and then you would go in the November period to be able to do that first payment. Is that accurate, Kate?
That's correct.
Let's see. So we spoke a little bit earlier about out-of-state hazardous waste fees in context of the G&H fee for a destination site. So just reiterating here too that once the hazardous waste comes into California, and I think Kate, you phrased this as becoming subject to California regulation, that waste is then subject to the fee. And so it's that first handler, if you will. Once it crosses the border, they would become the generator for purposes of the fee, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And it's always good to reiterate some of this information. I know I've been doing this topic for a while and I'm still learning it, I think, every day. Okay, let's see. So last year, the G&H fee letters that were sent to my organization had tonnage that was different from the actual amount on our weight tickets. It's time consuming and difficult to obtain the weight tickets. Is there a way for DTSC to improve this process? Either by annotating the letters or providing more specific information? Is there anything that we can do for that process?
So I can take that question again. I am not an expert in hazardous waste. I would say, however, the data that's in HWTS and the data that was used to send out those notification letters is based on what tonnage is reported in HWTS. It's incumbent upon the generator to one, make sure that the manifest tonnage is correct, and generators should be obtaining and maintaining their weight tickets to verify that the information under their EPID number is accurate in our reporting systems. So for any more detailed questions about manifest discrepancies, I would recommend that you reach out to our manifest help desk at manifestcorrections@dtsc.gov. Generators, again, should be tracking their manifest information, including their weight tickets, and alert the department to any discrepancies.
And I don't know if you'll know this question, or perhaps manifest corrections at dtsc.ca.gov would be the better place for this, but can a generator go in to validate that information at any time, or do they have to wait until they get this fee letter from DTSC to do that?
Yeah, there's no need to wait. HWTS is a publicly accessible system. You can, just query your EPID number and pull up all the manifests associated under your EPID number at any time. So you do not have to wait for any notifications. In fact, we encourage you to maintain that information and update us accordingly.
Okay, great. Let's see. So just to confirm, the G&H fee replaced the generator, disposal, manifest user, and the EPA ID number fees. These are all fees administered by CDTFA, and the prepayment for this will now be in November and February every year. So I think it might be helpful if we break that apart a little bit. So the first part, 4 fees: generator, disposal, manifest user, and EPA ID numbers. All of them were replaced by the G&H fee.
That's correct.
Okay. So second part, all of these fees, and I think we mean to say the G&H fee, is administered by CDTFA.
So yes, the generation and handling fee is administered by this fee. I do want to note, just kind of going back to the first question, the disposal fee and the generator fee were administered by CDTFA under the previous fee structure. The manifest user and the EPID fees were administered by DTSC through our EVQ system.
Okay, and you said earlier in this Q&A session, I believe it was, that EVQ no longer collects any fees because those 2 fees were repealed.
Correct.
Okay, so G&H fee is now with CDTFA, and then this takes us to the last part of this question. The payments for the G&H fee are now November and February every year.
That's correct. And that is a shift from reform. Under the previous fee structure, the prepayments were due in August with a return due in February. Now, given how, just the cycle of setting the rates, the prepayment is not due until November now with a February return due.
Okay. And then just
they stay the same.
Got it. Okay. And then just to reiterate, because I know it's confusing for everyone and we have to remind ourselves often, we're talking about calendar year for the waste that you generated, but the fiscal year for the payment. That's why it's November and then February, because I'm referring to the fiscal year period.
Correct.
Okay. Let's see. Are companies with less than 50 employees subject to the generation and handling fee?
Yes. So the generation and handling fee is based on the waste generated, not the number of employees a business might have. The environmental fee is employee based, whereas generation and handling fee is tonnage based.
Okay. So company size does not lend itself to the G&H fee.
No, it's just a flat per ton rate. Based on the waste generated, and employee counts are not a factor.
So we have a long question here, so I just want to make sure I'm reading it correctly. So some of the confusion, it seems, may have come from just this is a brand new fee structure. And so there's a lot of potentially new fee payers that hadn't paid in the past. Maybe they had one-time projects. So this transition from the old structure to the new structure has been a little bit confusing for them. So could you speak to maybe some of what DTSC and CDTFA are doing to maybe make this process a little bit more transparent or a little bit easier to understand? I think some of this was referred to already in Brian in your slides about recent activities, but perhaps you or Brian could speak to this, Kate.
Well, I'll take the first stab at it, and Brian, feel free to jump in if you have more. So we are increasing our communications and notifications to fee payers and to just our generators as a whole. To make sure that our generators are aware of the waste that they're generating and remind them to track and manage the information regarding the hazardous waste generated under their EPA ID. I would say, however, these fees are all self-reported, and so notices, for instances, outside of DTSC's notification letters, are not issued in advance of the return. So as a generator, you are responsible for making that prepayment and filing that return independently. We will obviously notify you of the rates, but the amount that is subject to the fee is going to be self-reported until after the return is filed and we've collected, or rather CDTFA's collected the information about what you've reported to DTSC. Was that the right question? I apologize if I missed the mark.
I think yes. There's a lot that you covered. So increased notification. Actually, some of the comments we received today is we're receiving too much notification. We've done this in the past. We know what we're doing. Is there a way to opt out or reduce the number of communications? So I'll just take a moment to acknowledge that we're trying to find a balance between making sure fee payers understand what they need to do and when, and trying to figure out what's the best way to communicate with everyone. So again, a plug for staying engaged in this whole process. We are only 2 years into this new fee structure, and we do have these intentional moments to engage in the processes. So if you have feedback, please certainly send them our way. If Sheena, you could drop the fees comment and questions link again, that would be great, because we want to hear from you. We want to continue improving our processes and the way that we engage with our fee payers and our generators. And we really can only do that if we hear from you. So please do take that moment. It looked like, Brian, you're about to come off mute for a moment. So.
Oh, well, I think you said it very well. I think I was just going to reiterate that we are trying to make a more concerted effort to communicate effectively. If that ends up being a little too much communication, that's a good thing for us to hear and to learn to understand. Importantly, it's I think particularly around the generation and handling fee, but really for all three fees, it's both. We thought it important to communicate both because we have the new structure of the fee, but also a whole new process. Under the old fee structure, these were static fees, aside from some CPI adjustments. Not only did the structure change, though, of course, now we have a new process working collaboratively with the board that is an annual adjustment process, and we want to make sure that we're engaging with folks so that you all have the information you need, and so that you not only know how to pay the fee, but also understand what opportunities you have to engage in that process.
Great. So we're at 11:55, so we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to look for a couple more questions that are as broadly applicable to our audience today as I can. I think one that pops out is, if we were a one-time generator due to a construction project and we then deactivated our EPA ID, do we still need to report every year? And I think the answer is, in that specific case, no. Once you deactivate your ID, you don't have to continue reporting. But as a reminder, CDTFA's account registration system is separate from our EPA ID system. So you do need to communicate to CDTFA as well that you no longer have an active ID. so that you can deactivate your account over there. And I apologize to CDTFA if you're listening in and I misstated those instructions. So definitely go check out their resources for the correct steps. But if you do have an EPID number that has not been deactivated, you are still required to continue reporting on it and to continue filing your returns. And I think, Kate, I said that correctly. You've told this to me a few times. So
Yes, that's correct.
okay, great. I will call that a win for myself today. Okay, so one trouble I have found is disposal facilities are not providing weight tickets for roll-off bins, resulting in DTSC using a generic weight for each of the bins. This has resulted in a significant overcharge for my 2 sites. What's the best approach to ensure the disposal facility provides the weight tickets with the manifest? I see it was answered live and closed, but I want to give an opportunity just to reiterate that response. Maybe we don't have our experts today.
So I can't speak specifically regarding what the requirements are for disposal facilities to provide weight tickets, other than I do believe they are required to do so. And you as a generator should be ensuring that they continue to do so. If you have any concerns regarding compliance or, facilities doing the things that they're supposed to do, please feel free to reach out to the RAO's office to provide some assistance and guidance in terms of what to do during these circumstances.
Great. And so the RAOs, that's going to be our regulatory assistance office. And so it's rao@dtsc.ca.gov. And I think we have time for one more question before we go to our closing remarks. And this is going to be perhaps a question to you, Kate. Are school districts exempt from the EVQ and the generation and handling fee?
Yeah, so schools do have to complete EVQ if they generate 5 or more tons of hazardous waste. And they should and in order to generate, they should have an ID number and information on the manifested waste. Whether or not they're subject to the generation and handling fee really depends on the total amount of waste generated and the circumstances under which the waste is generated. So again, that government exemption is more case specific. It's a case by case basis on whether or not a government entity may or may not be exempt from that waste. If you believe you are exempt, you may go through an appeal or redetermination process with CDTFA, but it is not a blanket exemption, and they are required to pay the fees and report.
Okay, so I think that's all we have time for today. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So as we close today's workshop, I'd like to once again thank our presenters for sharing all this information today. And I'd like to thank all of you for spending your morning with us. We have a few final housekeeping items before we sign off. I just want to remind everyone that today's workshop was recorded along with the questions that were submitted through the Zoom Q&A function. And so an email will go out to all of you in a few days who registered for this event, letting you know the recording has been posted on our DTSC Fees events webpage. If we didn't get to your question today, there were quite a few that came in that we did not have time for. But if we didn't get to your question today or you submitted it anonymously, we encourage you to reach out to the board or to DTSC. We put in various contact forms for you. You can see them on the screen here. We want to be able to follow up with you directly. I do also want to make the point of saying that many of your questions are applicable to several other fee payers and generators. And so we're working on an FAQ that we can post on our webpage to make it easier for you to find the information that you're looking for. So if we did not get to your specific question, again, please do reach out and follow up with us. We're working through a lot of different questions that we've received and trying to turn those into FAQs that we can post online to be more helpful. But it is quite a process, as you've heard today. Some of this information is complex or nuanced or case specific. So please be patient for that. And as always, reach out with your questions, comments, concerns. We heard some suggestions about how frequently and through which ways that we communicate. Those are wonderful suggestions. And again, we do want to hear from you so we can improve our services to you. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you on this topic in the coming weeks. And with that, have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone.